Welcome back to another episode of the Braun Performance and Rehab Podcast. Joining me today is Jason Rotger. Jason and I met at a conference in Pittsburgh earlier this year, and we were able to discuss a lot of different things surrounding training and performance and so on that way. So it's only natural that we do a podcast about that. And I really appreciate Jason's approach to what we would call the hybrid athlete, where he's actually able to develop strength type qualities and endurance type qualities simultaneously. So we dive into that on the podcast today. And Jason has a background as a D1 decathlete. So I feel like he's really well versed in this space of being able to do multiple things at the same time based on the sport and based on the coaching that he does that way. So really fun episode today. Really appreciate Jason's time. And obviously episodes like this are made possible by our sponsor, ISOFIT. ISOFIT is my go-to for all things isometric strength training and can help you and your athletes win more and hurt less. For more on ISOFIT, you can check the description below. Enjoy. Jason, welcome to the podcast. I'm super excited to work with you today, man. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
For people who might not be familiar with you or your online program or all the great things that you're doing, would you mind filling them in a little bit about who you are?
Yeah, so I am an aspiring athlete. Been obsessed with sports since I was a little kid. From trying to qualify for world championships in BMX racing to starting the decathlon in college to now still pursuing the decathlon, but outside of college, it's been a different ball game. And through this time, with my obsession of learning how to become a better athlete, has just created this spark to become a coach. And with that, I now want to share like everything I've learned from reading books, attending seminars. Like that's like where you and I met at, just to share with other people that don't have the knowledge or coaches or access to facilities like I did, and just kind of point them in the right direction.
Yeah, that concept of kind of lifting everyone up and helping everyone around us kind of hit that higher ground of life, so to speak, from a performance standpoint. And I think that your background combining BMX and decathlon is really unique. I don't meet too many people who have done both of those. And I think that both of those require a lot of different things, especially decathlon. It's, that's not something you can only be good at one or two things and still come out on top. You really have to be a jack of all trades, for lack of a better way to put it.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. And I'm still struggling on some of those trades, but that's where the obsession of learning comes from. Is how can you be the best at the 100-meter dash, but also run a sub 5 minute mile? So, and
Yeah.
that's, I think a lot of sports have all those qualities, which is why it's helped me so much in my coaching career, just because like those are the two completely polar opposite sides of the spectrum. And that's really the majority of sports, especially any field sport. You need aerobic qualities, but also you need a ton of speed and power qualities.
So what you're saying is it's actually possible to develop aerobic qualities while also pushing the envelope on speed and power and explosiveness that way simultaneously?
Extremely. Yeah. There will be a limit, just because of stuff like the interference effect and just from fatigue and recovery standpoint, but it is extremely possible to push both of those envelopes.
I think that's such a important point already, Jason, is I think a lot of people, we tend to get lost in developing one specific quality or one specific trait, or we hone in on one KPI that we think is going to make all the difference in the world. When in reality, I don't really think we've found that magic pill yet. I don't really think there's that one thing that's going to set everyone apart. In reality, I think it's all of the things combined together that will accumulate over time to make the difference. At the end of the day, your athletes have to be strong. They have to be well conditioned and they have to be fast. All of these traits or characteristics combined is what makes the difference. It's not just one of them, and I would say that they tend to run hand in hand together. I think that there's a good correlation between how strong someone is and what their sprint time is. I don't see a whole lot of people who are really weak and struggle to put force in the ground running really fast times the majority of the time. Unless there's some like genetic freak obsession, a lot of times as we get stronger, we will sprint faster. Or as we sprint faster, we also get stronger because there's a lot of load through a variety of different muscular groups and tissues in the body when we do sprint. So I think that the more we kind of look at these things together as a holistic view instead of a piece by piece view, the better off our athletes are going to be.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I mean, what's the point in being the fastest guy on the team if you can't make it through the second half? That's kind of the way I look at it.
Yeah, and not only that, but what happens when the game goes into overtime or double overtime, or when you're in the weekend tournament and, game 3 of the weekend tournament rolls around. If you're not able to prepare, if you're not able to perform in a fatigued environment, then no one cares how fast you can run if you can't even step foot on the playing field.
Yeah, I completely agree.
So on that notion, I think we understand that it's important to cover all these different things. And I think that a lot of athletes can relate to that. They want to be good at everything. They don't want to be known for just one thing. They want to be able to jump high. They want to be able to run fast. They want to be able to last across the entire game span or timeline that ways. And I think that, having the appropriate way to train that hits all of these different stimuli, but in a systematic type of way, I guess I'll say, is essential. So when it comes to the work that you're doing with the athletes that you work with and what you've kind of found throughout your own experience, both as an athlete and a coach, how do you go about kind of systematically developing a program or an approach to address all these different qualities when, as you mentioned, there can be a little interference between them all?
Yeah, so that's the puzzle. That's why there's so much research out there. That's why there's so many books and just people obsessed with learning is, there's no one way to do it. And then especially just depending on how the athlete and how their like just the way their brain chemistry is, some people are going to be more prone to like high frequency throughout the week of high intensity training, such as sprints, lifts, that kind of stuff. When some people might need some more moderate type work around like 80% effort sprints, but more frequent throughout the week. So just honestly, just depending on how our genetics are too, that's going to play a huge role. So there's really no one way or one template fits all kind of thing. The way I have personally used with my athletes and myself before was a high-low system. So that's kind of founded by Charlie Francis back in I think it was like the 70s or 80s. Whenever that time was with Michael Johnson, but he was kind of one of the first guys to do the high-low system, and that's just a high neural day followed by a low neural day and more aerobic-based quality. So kind of flushing out the system and kind of helping you recover for the next high-intensity day. So that's, Monday high intensity, Tuesday low intensity, Wednesday high, Thursday low, etc. And he followed that template. I think that's a phenomenal way for beginners who are very raw and need more sprint frequency just because it's a technique and you need to practice it. And then on those low days, you're still hitting the aerobic quality. You're still doing some easy running. You're getting more volume in. But what I've seen is as the athletes get more advanced and they're putting out just much higher outputs, that becomes a little too much. And I've actually this past year switched from a high-low to 2 extremely high days in the week. So as of right now, we're doing Monday and Thursday are our pure speed power days, heavy weight room days. Like we're getting after it. And in my opinion, those are the fun days. But I have 2 days between because now it's a full 72-hour recovery, which is supposed to be a full nervous system recovery. So we're going into those sessions completely fresh, like ready to go. And then in between that, we'll do our recovery work. We'll do swim work. We'll do tempo running and med ball circuits and general strength, and we'll kind of fill in the holes there between those sessions. But those 2 days are the days where we're really trying to get after it and push the threshold.
Yeah, I like the concept of the high-low days, and I like the concept too of factoring in a neural fatigue standpoint, because I think this is something that is often missed or forgotten about, is just how essential the nervous system is in playing a role in any physical, activity or any physical attribute that we want to look at that way. It all starts from a neural standpoint, and the nervous system actually sending a signal to the muscle in order to perform whatever task we are putting on it. And you're right, if we do too much, too high of an intensity for too long, we can certainly fatigue that side of things. And, you start to run into issues where people just don't feel as good and they don't perform as good. And it's one of those deeper levels of fatigue that we tend to struggle to measure and struggle to understand from the neural side. And I think that in itself could be its own podcast, because there's so many factors that can impact that overall neural fatigue. But I think you're right. I think, a 72-hour recovery period from training for that between high days, especially if you're really pushing the envelope, is essential. But I think it's also to kind of understand deeper what those high days really, really look like and what those low days really, really look like, because I think high intensity and low intensity means different things for different people. And that high intensity day, you mentioned sprinting, and on the low intensity days, you mentioned more, tempo run and low intensity steady state type work and that sort of thing that way. But even understanding from like a lifting and strength training standpoint, I think on the high intensity day, if you're really trying to push the envelope, like, you should be physically exhausted by the end of your training. I think those heavy compound lifts that typically get thrown in, whether that's, your Olympic lifting or your barbell complexes, like the squat, the deadlift, that sort of thing. Like, these are, extremely demanding lifts if done properly. And I emphasize that point, properly, because I think a lot of times these lifts are actually underloaded or underappreciated or undervalued in the type of stimulus and effect they have on the body. So understanding like just how hard you have to push, and then those lower intensity days you mentioned, like, in addition to the tempo runs, you mentioned like med ball circuits and different things like that. And that makes me think that you're kind of training on more of a full body type of split or full body sort of approach, as opposed to like a, part by part complex, for lack of a better way to put it, right? Instead of just doing like a chest and tries and a back and bis day, it's like, no, every time we're training, we're actually training the entire body, which I'm actually a big fan of for the athletic population, because it's not like you can step on the field or court or whatever that way and only decide to use two muscle groups that day. It's like, it's all out, all effort, entire body, every single time you step on.
Yeah, well, actually, I've never even thought about it that way. That's a great way to look at it. The reasoning I do more full body circuits is just because it elevates your heart rate. And there's this thing called lactate shuttle, which I'm sure you're familiar with. But when the legs are getting full of lactate and they can't flush it out anymore, the body sends it to the upper body. But now if we're doing max push-ups, now our upper body is getting full of lactate. And well, first of all, lactate's not bad, but it's all the byproducts that come with it. Just putting that out there. But if we're now pumping our upper body with it, now it's flushing it to the legs. And now you have this full body thing going on. And your body is like, oh my gosh, where do I send these byproducts? And so just by doing that, it elevates your heart rate. It increases much more aerobic benefits. And so by doing full body circuits, I can get a much better cardio stimulus out of it versus if we were to just run and the upper body is being used minimally. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. And on that point of just fluid mechanics and movement of byproducts that way, this is an area where I think that the isometrics are very undervalued and underappreciated that way. Is, from a basic force velocity curve standpoint, the highest forces are going to occur at the lowest velocities. So I think if we zero velocity, we all know what's going to happen from a force standpoint. So if we're training that super high force muscular contraction of the entire body, from a overall fluid movement standpoint, fluid moves through the venous and lymphatic system on a return standpoint, and the muscle pump is absolutely essential to moving that fluid and pushing that along, because the veins in the body don't have the same kind of lining that the arteries do. So if we can actually train super high force of contractility of muscles across the entire body, then we're going to be able to move fluid across our body a lot easier and more effectively, because every contraction is at a higher force, if that makes sense. Shifting our force output from the muscle higher so that all the underlying vasculature is compressed more and fluid is moved along easier.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I was actually doing some reading on that yesterday by Louis Simmons of Westside Barbell. He was actually talking exactly about what you just mentioned. Cool to hear that in a conversation.
I was going to say, is that something that you incorporate in your own programs then? Is there like a full body isometric element to it? And is that more of a low intensity stimulus for you, a high intensity stimulus, an everyday stimulus? Is it more of a warm up or a cool down, or where do isometrics fit into this whole thing for you?
Yeah, so I've definitely messed around with them before, and as of right now, I do more yielding ISOs for just for tendon health. So like at the end of a weights day, we might do 2 sets of 30-second heavy loaded calf raise. Just hold in the concentric the completely plantar flex position. So I'll do stuff like that, or I'll do a split stance ISO for time. But I do more duration type ISOs, um, just from a tendon health perspective and recovery. But I don't really do max ISOs, especially in the college setting, just because with the team, it gets more difficult. Some people won't be given their max effort. Some people will be given too much effort and not taking enough breaks because they're like, well, I'm giving my best effort. It feels like I'm giving my best effort, but if you're not taking the proper recoveries, you're really not. But they have no way of tracking that because we don't have a force plate in every single squat rack, so we can't actually track that. So that's the main reason I don't use stuff like overcoming ISOs. It's just I like to give them more something to push, something like to reach for. So that's where we use velocity based trackers or just heavy weights, just so they can see it moving. It just creates a better motivation.
It,
But I have used it personally, and I use it as a contrast method. So I'll do a couple seconds max effort into hurdle hops, and I'll do circuits like that. But I really only use it for myself personally. When it comes to coaching athletes, I don't utilize the intense ISOs or overcoming. I only use yielding for tendon health.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned something there about long duration ISOs as well. And I think that this is such a great way for athletes to actually experience that quote unquote fatigued state, right? As we
Mm-hmm.
started this podcast talking about, it's not enough to just be fast or just be strong. You have to have the endurance to have those qualities and attributes last for the entire duration of whatever competition you're in. So we have to train athletes in a state of fatigue in some way. You mentioned about velocity-based training, and I think that that's a great tool in the toolbox. But at the end of the day, if I tell every athlete that I work with to stop after they, stop hitting a certain velocity, then I'm essentially saying, hey, you fatigued. It's time to stop this lift, or it's time to stop training, which again,
Mm-hmm.
there is a time and a place for that in this puzzle. But we also have to make sure that we're training the athlete in a fatigued state. And I think that's a great spot for the isometrics to come in. So I think, as we're kind of going through this all, it sounds like your high intensity day is going to involve some kind of sprint work or very high speed focused work, some types of heavy lifting. There might be some VBT incorporated in it and some type of prolonged isometric type of hold that way. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, that's pretty accurate. The ISO I normally put, actually not normally, I always put it at the end as they're either the cool down or just to get the legs shaking and just leave the gym feeling good. But I've actually never used it as a team warm up. So those normally go at the end.
Yeah, no, and it's interesting you said the concept of make sure they leave the place feeling good, because I think that's something we often forget about or take for granted from a coaching side of things. It's, after athletes finish our workout, how do we want them to feel? Do we want them to feel exhausted and, can barely stand up and walk out of there? Or do we want them to kind of leave and walk out feeling better than they started with? And I think that, having that kind of approach or mentality to what we do from a coaching and programming standpoint kind of gives us a new way to look at things, right? I think historically a lot of coaches like to see their athletes struggling to walk out after, a super intense leg session. But nowadays, I personally really like when my athletes are walking out telling me, hey, I feel better than when I walked in today.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I completely agree. And especially because, I want them to be excited about training and I want to create a better motivation because, greater motivation to train just means they're going to be pushing the outputs way better. Of course, there are days where you're going to have them, I hate my life. I don't want to get off this ground kind of days. Like those days are necessary, just not all the time. Like when you need them, throw them in, sure. if it's, smart and you're not just doing junk volume to do junk volume. But I think having them motivated to train and enjoy training and to really push those outputs can go a long way in the long-term view of coaching.
Yeah, and that's an essential piece on the long-term side. And you and I were even talking before we jumped on from a recording standpoint here about the value and consistency and long-term growth. And while that can be true for a lot of different things, whether it's business, finances, social media, whatever, that also holds true from an athletic development standpoint is if we can get our athletes to fall in love with that process of improving themselves and bettering themselves, and they stick with it for a long time, those results are going to compound exponentially, as opposed to, hey, they're really bought in for like 2 months and then they get tired and they take, 2 months off and we don't see them for a while. And then they come back in and they go all in for a while and then they disappear again. It kind of creates like a roller coaster type of system. And with that lack of consistency, I think we see a lack of progress. And I think athletes start to get really, really frustrated about where they're at. And I think the more we can kind of work some of those things to keep them enjoying the training and making sure that they actually leave feeling good and they're excited to come back for the next session, the more we're able to kind of provide for that long-term overall athletic development piece.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And it's kind of funny. So my wife is a pole vaulter and she's not huge on the training side of things, like the weightlifting and running and, just the training side. Like she loves to pole vault and that's what she wants to do. When we first started dating, she hated the weight room and everything. And for a while, she started getting frustrated because she's like, why did my power clean improve so fast, but now I haven't improved in 2 years? So I kind of saw that firsthand, like having no improvements or just kind of being stale. It really kind of just bums you out. I'm like, dang, I don't want to go do this. But this summer, I was like, listen, I'm making you a promise. We're going to get stupid strong and fast. And she has PR'd every single lift within 6 weeks of training, just consistent training. And she's been training this is gonna be year 4. She's been training with me. Well, I've been coaching her. And this is like her first time really seeing results. So now it's like this spark has been ignited after 2 years. It's just I don't want to lift or run because I'm not seeing results kind of deal. But now that she's really seeing it, it's like fired her up and she's excited to lift, which is something I haven't seen in a little bit of time. So just a little firsthand experience there.
Do you find that those low days in between the high days are well received by athletes or, in this case, your wife that way? Because I don't know about you, Jason, but I really like going to the gym and training really, really hard. I don't like just feeling like I'm going through the motions. I don't like feeling like I'm not pushing the needle forward every time. And I feel like athletes, especially, they're very competitive. A lot of them, they want to win. So
Mm-hmm.
I think the concept of, hey, slow down is not always well received. So how do you go about kind of getting athletes to understand the importance of, a lower, slower day or the value in that?
That's that's tough. Especially when we do we do stuff like tempo running. I want it 60 to 70% effort. I don't tell them like, hey, I want it at this percentage, but I tell them like, if your legs are burning, slow down. I was like, don't worry about the person next to them, but I try and tell them to focus on a feeling that I want them to get to. So I'm like, if your legs are starting to burn up and you're getting lactic in your hamstrings, you're going too hot and too fast. So I need you to slow that down. And then over time, you'll start to feel it. But the low days don't really feel like low days. If anything, they actually feel harder, at least from the workouts I program, just because, the heart rate's elevated, you're working the cardiovascular system. So it is a little bit more comfortable than doing speed stuff. So I don't really have like many problems with the low days just because from a workload standpoint, it's higher volume and they feel like they're getting a good pump and good workout in. But when it comes to telling them to slow down, that's kind of the cue I give is like, if you're burning up or you're feeling like you're at an 8 out of 10, like just bring it down a notch. Everything I do is for time. So they don't have to like try and get there to, run 100 meters faster so the rep is over faster. It's for time. So if they push it harder, it's just going to make it even harder for themselves, which I think doing everything for time has helped that a lot.
Yeah, no, definitely. And you mentioned about kind of you said the word pump in there, and my mind instantly went back to a podcast we did earlier this year with Tony Pedrati from Syracuse, where Tony mentioned in his kind of framework and the way his mind works, all arm training to him is low intensity training because you mentioned before about the nervous system side of things, the neural demands of the body figuring out how to do a bicep curl versus how to figure out how to do a power clean are two very different things. And I find, especially with a lot of the athletes I work with nowadays, if I tell them to go to the gym and do more arm farm in between our sessions, they're all about it. So kind of using a different line of thought on the low intensity day and say, hey, look, these are more isolated type movement patterns that they can crush, they're going to get a pump, they're going to be hyped because we're literally telling them to do more bicep curls. And I think even from a sports standpoint, regardless of the sport, there's actually value in that. I know everyone is obsessed with legs and core, and don't get me wrong, those are my favorite things to train, but we can't forget about what's going on up top either, right? Like, I see a lot of lacrosse athletes, and it's like if you take a hit to the arm in a sport like lacrosse, you want to have some kind of armor or protection or just beef and bulk there to kind of like protect you a little bit and cushion it a little bit. Same thing with baseball, or, you mentioned that you had kind of a BMX and bike riding kind of background that way as well. I mean, if you can't grip the handlebars for the duration of your race, then, you're kind of out for the count. So it's one of those things where I think the low intensity days, like you mentioned, can actually be more intense and more fun in the perception of the athlete, even though they're not necessarily doing the same kind of like neural strain, if you will, as the high intensity day.
Yeah, for sure. And then there's also like the psychological aspect to it because, if you have an arm pump or for girls, if you have like a leg pump or a booty pump, like you feel better about yourself. You're like, you look in the mirror like, wow, I look good, or I look like an athlete. And it creates like a positive reinforcer almost. So I think there's also that kind of side to it too.
There definitely is. There definitely is. And while we've kind of been going through your own kind of approach to the high days, the low days, and how to develop multiple athletic attributes of strength and speed and power and endurance simultaneously, I realized that there's probably more than one way to skin a cat. And your own approach has probably evolved over your time and experience as a coach and an athlete. So what's different about the way you approach programming for yourself and for others now than maybe where you were a few years ago? What's evolved for you over time, Jason?
Yeah, so this has actually been a really fun journey because when I was a junior in college, I was our track team strength coach. So I was still an athlete and I was still on the team, but I was writing the weight room workouts for the jumpers, multis, and then started the sprinters about a year ago. But I've been doing the jumpers and multis for about three or four years now. So it's been fun going from a student who didn't really know what he was doing and learning to like being the coach I am now. But looking back, I was definitely force oriented in the weight room, which isn't a bad thing. But in the weight room, like I use it as a ends, not a means to an end. So I wanted everyone to get a big clean, big squat, big deadlift. So like the stronger you are, the easier it'll be out on the field. Which I wasn't that far off. I wasn't that wrong, but just the volume and stuff I had was looking back a little bit high. Luckily, no one got injured in the past couple of years. I'd never had injured since I started coaching, so been lucky there. But just from the nervous system standpoint, I did so much in the weight room that I guarantee you no one really improved their sprint times just because they were fried. But weight room numbers went up. So once we kind of backed off in season, everyone started seeing results. But I definitely kind of beat them down to the ground a little bit too hard. Now the focus is more on quality. The sessions are still super hard, but instead of doing basic squats 5x5, we're doing 8 sets of 2, and we're taking a minute to 2 minutes between sets, and we're making sure that the velocity is not dropping. So it's more quality stuff like that. So lower reps, higher sets, and we're still getting after it. But just from what I've seen in strength and power improvements, it is the reps do not matter. It is the quality of the reps are what really matters. And so that's kind of my focus whenever we enter the weight room.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great point. And I think a lot of times until you kind of get into the coaching world, you're still kind of lost in the understanding of where the minimum effective dose is and where the maximum effective dose is for the exercise that we prescribe and program that way, right? Like everything we do is going to have an effect. Think about it like a pharmaceutical agent, right? Like, they start with a certain dose, and if it's getting the response that they want, then they're going to leave it at that dose. And sometimes you might need more of a dose. And if you go too high, then you start to run into side effects and things that you don't want to see from a adaptation standpoint. So the same is true with training. We want to give enough to move the needle forward. We want to give enough to cause the adaptation that we want. And we have to stress the system in order to get that. But if we go too much off the deep end, you're right. We might see gains in the weight room, but that might not carry over to, on field or in-game performance. And, at the end of the day, Molly Benetti said it best on the podcast recently, where she said, hey, we just keep the main thing. And for them, the main thing is basketball. So, for our standpoint here, whatever sport the athlete is playing has to be the main thing. And, just because their bench press improved 10 pounds doesn't make them, instantly better at their sport. So making sure that whatever we do in the weight room is, under the lens of the sport is the main thing. And this is going to support that instead of the weight room is going to take over for the sport, because I think sometimes we get lost on that side of things. I echo your point too about the importance of quality. I think that sometimes we are willing to trade quality for more volume when sometimes that extra volume is not needed. A lot of times, especially in season, athletes already have too much volume. They're doing, 2 to 3 hours of practice multiple times per week. They're probably hitting a few lifts on their own. They're probably not sleeping great. Their recovery status is kind of in limbo, which, again, that's a whole nother thing we could talk about separately. But, at the end of the day, it's not the kind of thing where we have to beat them down in the weight room every single time when their current life situation is often beating them down enough as it is.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. And especially, so most of my athletes are track and field. And I was actually doing some learning on triple jump yesterday on the forces they experience in the flight phases. So when it comes to max speed sprinting, as you know, it's about 5 to 6 times your body weight for each step. For change of direction, it's even higher, up to 8 times your body weight. But when it comes to triple jump, they can experience up to 15 times their body weight on each jump. And now that is probably the most intense stimulus I have found in all of sports, which makes, I don't know, just makes it one of the most impressive events out there from a physical standpoint. But after seeing that, I'm like, wow. And I see these people do triple jump every single weekend at meets. I'm like, no wonder people don't improve, because if you're doing that every single week and you're putting 15 times your body weight or your force onto each leg when you're doing a triple jump phase, that accumulates week to week. And then you're training in between. If you're not getting proper recovery, you are beating yourself up. So that's just something I realized yesterday. I'm like, wow, there's so many forces behind. And that's not just triple jump, that's any sport. Is every time you're changing direction and you're putting all these forces in your body. But we can't see those forces. And that's the tricky part. And the way we can see someone squatting 400 pounds and we're like, oh, okay, they have 400 pounds on their back. But we can visibly see that. But when they're on the field or the track, you can't see how much load is actually on their body. So it might not seem like a lot, especially if they walk away clean and uninjured, but they're taking some load and some stress without realizing it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things that I think opens up the conversation of, there's some athletes who are a little apprehensive in the weight room, and they're just, not confident per se, but they don't feel like they can do what you're asking them to do. And when you kind of break it down like that, the athlete kind of realizes like, oh, wow, I've actually experienced these forces before. I've been in these shoes before. It's just, it looks a little different. It's packaged slightly different, if you will. So I think that, understanding that the athlete is no stranger to the forces that, are put on their body. It's just the gym applies those forces in a slightly different way than they might experience on the playing field or on the track that way.
Yeah, for sure. And you don't really realize it until you get on a force plate or you read some research, but you don't see the spikes in the forces unless you're
Yeah,
actually trying to learn about it.
no, definitely. And, you brought up the concept of force plates and data and that sort of thing. And, I think Rob Wilson said it best recently. A lot of people are obsessed with the data and they're claiming that data is king. And I think that, the way Rob outlined it, it's more of a context is king, because the data is going to be relevant to the individual who's interpreting the data, and it's going to be relevant to the specific sport demand and the specific athlete. And there's so much additional factors that go into it that way. So just understanding that the data is a piece to the puzzle, but we can't hang our hat yet on that one single force plate metric or that one single study yet. As we've talked about across this entire podcast, it's really accumulation of everything coming together that wins us at the end of the day. And it's not one size fits all. It's not one magic bullet that does the trick. It's how do we put everything together into a larger framework that allows us to develop the athlete holistically.
Yeah, for sure. And that's like I was saying in the beginning, like that's the puzzle of coaching and why I think people get obsessed with it and, trying to find the way to build the ultimate athlete.
Definitely, Jason. I feel like we've covered a lot of different ground as it relates to your kind of approach to developing so many different athletic qualities simultaneously that way. Do you have any kind of closing thoughts or closing remarks or anything that we might have missed as we were chatting today?
No, but I guess just a little summary from what I've been saying is uh there's many ways to form a week or template a week or even a session itself. But really just have to ask yourself, what does this athlete need or what do I need as an athlete? And really kind of just focus on your strengths and weaknesses and just tailor to that. Don't do, what your textbook said or what your master's class said, but really figure it out on your own and like what works for you, what doesn't work for you, because there's no one way to do any form of training.
Jason, for people who want to find out more about you and all the stuff that you've got going on online and so on that way, where can they find you at online?
Yeah, so I'm really just on Instagram. They can follow me at Jason Rotger. So just my name, nothing fancy.
Awesome.
And
We'll
then
link to the
I do have a YouTube page too. My wife and I do a training vlog, which is I believe it's Rockers 23. Not 100% sure, but I'll send you a link for that.
Yeah, awesome. We'll link to all of that in the description below. That way, if you didn't quite catch it, you can just click there and see everything that Jason is up to. Jason, this was awesome, man. I really appreciate your time. Thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It was a blast.